It was a Tuesday morning in the late summer of 1997, and the Jordan estate in Highland Park, Illinois, was operating with the quiet efficiency that characterized its daily rhythm during the basketball off-season. The house was large in the way that only makes sense when you understand it had been designed not simply as a residence, but as a compound, a place that could accommodate family, staff, security, and the particular logistical requirements of a life lived at a level of public visibility that made ordinary domestic arrangements impossible. And the people who worked there had learned, most of them through direct experience, that the person whose name was on the gate was considerably different from the person whose image appeared on billboards and magazine covers across the country. Maria Sanchez had worked at the Jordan estate for 3 years by that summer. She was 44 years old, originally from central Mexico, and had come to the Chicago area in the late 80s through the particular combination of necessity and courage that characterizes the stories of people who leave everything familiar, because the alternative is watching their children grow up without enough. She had 2 children, a daughter named Elena, who was 19 and had just started community college, and a son named Diego, who was 16 and attended the local high school, where his teachers described him as someone whose intelligence exceeded the opportunities his circumstances had made available. Maria worked to change those circumstances. That was the organizing principle of her existence, stated simply and lived completely. Her work at the estate was thorough and reliable in ways that the household manager, Patricia, described as exceptional without drama. Maria did not require supervision. She moved through her responsibilities with the focused competence of someone who understood that the quality of her work was the foundation on which everything else in her life rested. The other staff liked her without making a production of it. She was warm in the particular way of people who reserve warmth for genuine moments, rather than deploying it as social currency. What nobody at the estate knew was that Maria had been experiencing symptoms for several weeks she had been unable to afford to investigate properly. There had been dizziness on certain mornings, a heaviness in her chest she had attributed initially to fatigue, and then to stress, and then, when it persisted past the point where either explanation was convincing, to something she preferred not to name. She had not seen a doctor. The insurance coverage available through her employment was basic in a way that made certain kinds of medical care practically inaccessible, and the out-of-pocket cost of the specialist visits her symptoms probably warranted was a number she had calculated and placed in the category of things that would have to wait until the circumstances allowed. She had mentioned the symptoms to Elena one evening in late July, framing them as minor and temporary, in the way that mothers frame health concerns to avoid burdening their children with worry that cannot be acted upon. Elena had wanted her to see a doctor immediately. Maria said she would when the timing was better. Eleanor accepted this because she was 19 and still learning that the timing is never better, that waiting for better timing is itself a decision with consequences. The morning it happened was ordinary up to the moment it was not. Maria had arrived at her usual time and begun her responsibilities in the east wing of the main house. It was approximately 9:45. Jordan was home, in a downstairs room on the opposite side of the house, in a meeting with 2 members of his business team about a commercial project when the sound reached them. It was not a dramatic sound. That was the detail people who were there consistently emphasized. Not a crash or a scream or any of the noises the word emergency tends to conjure. It was a dull, soft impact, the sound of something heavy meeting a hard floor without the resistance that consciousness provides. One of the business team members paused mid-sentence. Jordan was already standing. He moved through the house with the directional instinct of someone who had spent enough time in the space to navigate it without thinking, tracking the sound to its origin in a hallway off the East Wing kitchen. Maria was on the floor. She had not knocked anything over. She had simply lost consciousness, and the floor had received her without ceremony. Her cleaning cart was beside her, a bottle of solution still in her hand from the moment before she fell. Jordan knelt beside her immediately. He checked her breathing, which was present but shallow. He called her name twice, getting no response on the first and a small, disoriented sound on the second that indicated she was beginning to return to consciousness. One of his security staff had followed him into the hallway and was already reaching for his phone. Jordan told him to call an ambulance and gave the address with the calm specificity of someone suppressing urgency in order to be useful. He stayed on the floor beside Maria, his hand on her shoulder, speaking to her in a steady voice designed to give her something to orient toward as she came back. She regained full consciousness before the ambulance arrived. Her first coherent expression was not pain or confusion, but embarrassment, the particular mortification of someone who has caused disruption in a context where their role is to prevent disruption. She tried to sit up and Jordan put a gentle hand on her arm and told her to stay still. She said she was fine, she was sorry. She didn't know what had happened. He said she didn't need to be sorry, and that fine was something the paramedics were going to help determine. He said it without condescension, in the tone of someone stating a practical fact, rather than overriding her assessment of herself. When the paramedics arrived, they recommended she be taken to the hospital for evaluation. Maria began to object, not because she didn't understand the recommendation, but because the architecture of her financial situation made hospital visits genuinely threatening to the stability she had spent years constructing. She knew, with the specific knowledge of someone who had navigated American healthcare without adequate coverage, that a hospital visit involving tests and specialist consultations could produce bills that would take years to resolve. She began to calculate aloud, not directly, but in the hesitations and qualifications people use when the real reason they are declining something is not the reason they are able to say. Jordan understood what was happening. He had grown up in a family that was not wealthy, in a community where the gap between needing medical care and being able to access it without devastating financial consequences was a lived reality rather than an abstraction. He did not make a speech about it. He simply told Maria that the hospital was where she needed to go, and that everything related to the cost was taken care of, and that her only job right now was to let the doctors do what they needed to do. He said it in the same practical tone he had used when telling her to stay still, as if it were the obvious next step rather than a significant act. She looked at him for a moment, with an expression her daughter Elena later described as the expression of someone who has been told something they want to accept, but have learned through experience to be cautious about accepting. Jordan met her eyes and nodded once, communicating that the offer was real and not contingent on anything. She agreed to go. The hospital evaluation revealed that Maria had been experiencing symptoms of a cardiac condition that had gone undiagnosed and untreated for a period the cardiologist described as concerning. The condition was serious but manageable with proper treatment. Unmanaged, it carried risks the doctor laid out with careful directness. She would need medication, follow-up appointments, and adjustments to her routine during a period of treatment. None of it was catastrophic, as medical situations went. All of it required resources she did not have. Jordan had his assistant coordinate with the hospital before Maria's evaluation was complete. The arrangement covered her treatment fully, including specialist consultations, medication, and the follow-up care the cardiologist recommended over the following 6 months. It was handled administratively and quietly, through the kind of mechanism that exists to manage these things, without requiring the person being helped to navigate the process themselves. Maria was informed by a hospital administrator that her account had been settled and her ongoing care was covered. The administrator did not tell her by whom, because she had not been told to tell her, and the not telling was itself part of the decision that had been made. Patricia called Maria at the hospital that afternoon to check on her and to tell her that her position would be held and that her salary would continue uninterrupted during her recovery. This was not standard policy. Jordan had given the instruction within an hour of Maria being taken to the hospital, without apparent deliberation, as if the question of whether her income should continue while she recovered from a medical emergency that had occurred at his home had only one possible answer. Helena found out what had happened when she arrived home that evening, and found her mother at their kitchen table, looking simultaneously shaken and something else, something Elena struggled to name at first, and eventually identified as the expression of someone who has been treated with a dignity they had not expected and are still processing what that means. Maria told her daughter everything, including the financial arrangements she had been told about. Elena sat in silence for a moment after the account was finished. What Elena said she felt in that moment was not simply gratitude, though gratitude was present. It was something more specific. It was the feeling of having an assumption disproved. She had grown up understanding, through the accumulated evidence of her family's experience navigating American life, that proximity to extraordinary resources did not predict extraordinary kindness. What her mother's account described disrupted that understanding in the specific and meaningful way that a single genuine experience disrupts a generalization by proving it is not absolute. Diego processed the story differently. He had grown up with Michael Jordan as a cultural presence in the way teenagers of that era grew up with Jordan, as a symbol of achievement so elevated it had become almost abstract. What his mother's account gave him was something he had not previously had, which was a specific and human version of the person behind the symbol. Not Jordan the athlete or the brand or the icon, but the man who had stayed on the floor beside his mother until the paramedics arrived and had handled everything that followed, not as an obligation or a calculation, but as the straightforward response of someone who saw something that needed to be addressed and addressed it. Diego said later that this reframing mattered to him in ways that extended beyond his feelings about Jordan specifically. It gave him a different way of thinking about what success was supposed to produce in the people who achieved it, about whether the accumulation of extraordinary resources expanded or contracted a person's capacity for ordinary human responsiveness. His mother's story suggested the answer was not predetermined. That the man at the center of the most commercially saturated athletic image of his generation was capable of behaving. In a moment, nobody was watching and nothing external required, like someone who had not forgotten where he came from or what mattered. Maria returned to work at the estate 6 weeks later, her cardiac condition under treatment and her prognosis described by her doctor as genuinely good, given the intervention that had occurred when it did. She and Jordan did not have an extended conversation about what had happened. Both of them were people more comfortable with action than with the verbal processing of action after the fact. What changed was subtler than a conversation, a quality of acknowledgement in how they moved through the same spaces, a mutual understanding of something that did not require language to be real. She worked at the estate for 4 more years before retiring to be closer to her grandchildren when Eleanor had her first child. On her last day of work, Jordan was in Chicago and came to the estate specifically to be there. He gave her an envelope she did not open until she was in her car in the driveway. It contained a handwritten letter and a check that Elena later described as changing the financial circumstances of her mother's retirement from precarious to secure. The letter said what Jordan thought about the kind of work Maria had done and the kind of person he understood her to be. It was specific rather than general. It did not sound like something composed for an audience. Eleanor kept the letter. She said in later years that it was the document in her family's possession she valued most, not primarily for what it revealed about the person who wrote it, though it revealed something real, but for what it said about her mother. That someone who had operated at the highest possible platform of public achievement had looked at Maria Sanchez, a woman who cleaned his house and raised her children and managed her symptoms in silence because the timing was never better, and had found something worth writing down and keeping. The story of that Tuesday morning never became public the way stories about famous people become public. It circulated the way true things circulate, quietly, through the people who were there and the people they trusted with what they knew. Eleanor told it because she believed it deserved to be told, not as a story about celebrity kindness, which is a category that tends to flatten the specific into the generic, but as a story about a particular man responding to a particular woman in a particular moment with a completeness and lack of calculation that said something worth saying about who he was when nobody was watching. What it said, stated plainly, was that the person and the icon were not as separate as the scale of the icon made it easy to assume. That underneath the championships and the commercials and the cultural machinery built around his name was someone who had not forgotten what it cost to need help and not have it. And that on a Tuesday morning in Highland Park, when a woman looked up at him from the floor of his house, with the expression of someone calculating whether the help being offered was real, he answered that question in the only way that actually answers it. Not with words, with what he did next.